Hey, sixth graders, welcome back to our Bible study lesson on Mark. We are on lesson 5.3 and we're going to talk a little bit more about the success that Jesus had. I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about some examples from the Old Testament about people whom God used to perform miracles. There are lots of miracles that happened in the Old Testament. God used many people to perform those miracles. There were people God used to heal the sick, people whom God used to cast out demons, people whom God used to perform miracles over nature. Let's pause a minute, could pause the video a minute and think for just a little bit about some of those examples. You got some? Okay. You can think about maybe the prophet Elijah calling down fire from heaven to burn up the sacrifice. You could think about Elisha and how he raised someone from the dead, a young boy from the dead, and also healed a very important general of his leprosy. Think about David playing the harp and calming the evil spirit that King Saul had. You could think about Moses and the 10 plagues or parting the Red Sea. All through the Old Testament, God used different people to perform miracles. And one of the most important things that we need to understand about miracles is that miracles weren't performed for their own sake. I want you to look at John, the book of John, chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And in these verses, John tells us what the purpose of the miracles were and what his purpose in writing them down was. He said, therefore, many other signs, that's another word for miracles, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. The miracles were to prove, to show that Jesus was who he said he was. Jesus healed the sick, he cast out demons, he performed miracles over nature. Mark focuses on these marvelous things that Jesus did and the places that he visited. This is really important because Mark gives us place names. And what's important about that is that you could go check. You could go check a map from the time period and you could go see. And so anybody reading Mark's gospel during the time that it was written could go, and they could go to those places and check with the people who lived there to see if these things were true. Mark's book was mainly written for Romans. And in the Roman culture, power was very important and very valued. And that's what they viewed success, is if you had power, that was successful. And so Mark is showing the Roman readers that Jesus had the ultimate power, but that his power came through his submission to God and through his own selflessness in choosing to help the people that he helped. Now, we're going to go through these verses from the book of Mark. Mark chapter 1, 3, 7, 9, 4, and 16. Okay? We're going to go over them quickly. I want you to be sure to go back and read them. It's not terribly long. Any of these. In fact, you could probably read all of these verses in less than 15 minutes. So be sure to go back and read them word for word. I'm going to just kind of summarize them as we go through. So the first one is Mark chapter 1. And Mark chapter 1, verses 40 and 42. This story really starts in verse 40. And what happens is that a man who has leprosy comes to Jesus and begs him to be healed. And in verse 41, oh, I guess it does say 40. In verse 41, it says Jesus was moved with compassion. Compassion means to feel with someone. We usually use compassion in that if somebody is sad or hurting, we feel bad for them, we feel bad with them. But compassion can be a happy thing too. But in this case, of course, it was Jesus feeling very sad for this man. It says he was moved with compassion and he touched him. That's very important with a leper, because lepers were not allowed to be touched. Leprosy is a very highly contagious disease. And back then, they didn't have the medicines and the vaccines and the sanitation that we have now. And so if you had leprosy, you were cast out from everyone. The only people you could talk to were other lepers. Nobody would touch you. Even lepers wouldn't touch each other. And so for Jesus to reach out and touch him and say, I am going to make you well. And verse 42 says, immediately the leprosy left him. So for this one, we have an example of Jesus healing. I'm just going to write an H there for healing. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. In this case, Jesus goes into the synagogue, and in the synagogue there was a man whose hand was withered. That means that it didn't work. Sometimes you might see someone that has a hand that's kind of like this, and they can't move their hand because their hand just doesn't work. And if you don't use your muscles, they kind of shrink up a little bit. So this man's hand was withered. And they knew, the Pharisees knew that Jesus had been healing people, so they were watching him to see if he would heal this man, because it was the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath you're not supposed to do any work. And the Pharisees had very strict guidelines, even more strict than the guidelines that Moses gave in the law. In Leviticus, there are laws listed about work you can do on the Sabbath and work you can't. And the Pharisees put even more restrictions on that. So they were watching Jesus very closely. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. And he said to them, is it lawful to do good or to harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? And they wouldn't answer him. And he was angry about that, because Jesus understood that his healing the man was not work. That wasn't disregarding God's law of the Sabbath. And so he went ahead and he healed the man. He said, stretch out your hand. And the man reached out his hand, and immediately it went from being withered to being healed. Big deal. And another example of Jesus healing. So we're going to put an H here for healing. Now let's go to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7. Oop, I went a little bit too far. Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Jesus was trying to get away. But he couldn't, because his fame had spread and people were following him everywhere. And there was a woman who had a little daughter. It says a little daughter, which means that was probably a small child. And this child had an unclean spirit, and she came to Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this story is that this woman was a Gentile. This woman was not a Jewish person. She was not part of the nation of Israel. And she kept asking Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said to her, in verse 27, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. That's kind of harsh, Jesus. But Jesus was saying he came to Israel first. He had to take care of and teach the nation of Israel first. Now, we learn later on in the New Testament that the gospel is for everyone, but Jesus came to Israel first, and then it spread from there. And so he was saying, I have to do this first. But then this woman has a really snappy comeback, and she says, yes, but even the dogs under the table get the crumbs. And Jesus was so impressed with this woman's faith that he said, you know what, go. The demon is gone out of your daughter. So he didn't even have to see this child. He didn't even have to be near this child to cast out that demon. So we're going to write a letter C for casting out demons. Jesus has authority over everything, and that includes demons. Let's go to Mark chapter 9, verses 17 through 27. I think this is the one that's probably the longest of these. And in Mark chapter 9, verses 17, there was a man who had a son that had a spirit that made him mute. That means that when you're mute, you cannot talk. And he said, this demon, this spirit that my son has, when it seizes him, it slams him to the ground. He foams at the mouth. He grinds his teeth. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they couldn't. And Jesus got very irritated. He said, in fact, to his disciples, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. They brought the boy to him, and as soon as he saw the spirit, the evil spirit that the boy had, threw him into a convulsion. He fell on the ground. He was rolling. He was foaming at the mouth. And Jesus takes a minute to ask the dad, how long has this been going on? And the dad says, ever since he was a small child. In fact, this demon would try to throw him into the fire and into the water to kill him. Please, and he says, but if you can do anything, please help us. And Jesus says, if you can, everything is possible to him who believes. And this is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible, because the boy's father cried out and said in verse 24, I do believe, help my unbelief. Because sometimes don't we all have a little bit of doubt? And this man was saying, I do believe, I'm sorry for my doubt. Please help me through it. And Jesus talked to the spirit and said, I command you to come out of him and don't enter him again. And the boy was healed. So once again, we'll have a C for casting out a demon or an evil spirit. Now we're going to go back to Mark 4. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. You probably already know this story. This is the story of the apostles were in a boat, and they get in this boat to go to the other side of the sea. And one of the interesting things about the Sea of Galilee is a really big lake. And it has fierce and sudden storms that often come up. And just like that happens today, it happened then. And Jesus was in the boat and he was asleep in spite of this storm. The water is coming into the boat's filling up, and Jesus is napping. And the apostles woke him up. They were very upset, and they said, don't you care that we're about to die? And Jesus gets up, and it says he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, hush, be still. A rebuke is a sharp command to stop something. So like when you were little, if you ran it into your street and your mom or your dad says, cut that out, don't do that, come back here right away. That's a rebuke. And that's what Jesus did to the wind. And immediately the wind died down. And the apostles all looked at each other and went, who is this guy that even the wind and the sea obey him? Jesus commanded nature. So we're going to put an N for nature right there. And then the last one we're going to look at is Mark 16, Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. If I can get my Bible to turn over here. And this was Jesus' own resurrection. This is the story of, and you know this story, how Jesus rose from the dead. And this is kind of the miracle of all miracles, right? Resurrection. And what's really interesting is there were at least two other times that I can think of off the top of my head that Jesus raised someone else from the dead. In this case, he himself was resurrected from the dead. And that is the miracle that gives us the most hope of all. Jesus' whole purpose in coming to earth was not to do miracles. His purpose in coming to earth was to teach people what they needed to do to be saved and to give himself as that sacrifice so that salvation could happen. All of his selfless actions in healing other people, in calming the waves, in casting out demons, in raising people from the dead, all of those actions were to show that he did in fact have the power to forgive sins and to be the sacrifice that we all needed to be saved. We can follow Jesus' example in a lot of ways. Now, can I go around doing miracles? No, I can't. I wish I could. That would be really great. I would love that. But I can't. I can't follow Jesus in that way. But I can follow Jesus' example by helping other people when and where I can. I can follow Jesus' example of being a servant to other people. And I can follow Jesus' example in not only being a servant to other people, but teaching them about what they need to do to be saved. So to finish up this lesson, you're going to complete page 19 in your book. There are the first three questions are opinion questions. You're going to read a story from the Bible, and then you are going to try to think of a way that you could follow Jesus' example. How these traits of God help you grow in your faith. Okay? And then the last one is a little math section. This won't be very difficult, but if it is, be sure to email me for help on it, and I'm happy to help you. Again, please remember that these worksheets should not take you any longer than 15 to 20 minutes to do. And if they do, then be sure to email me and ask me for help, and I will see you next time.